असली हिप हॉप आज संजय एमसी कौर पाली मैं सरकार रिदम फ्लाइंग स्लो बिल्कुल सब है पार्ट सक्षम ज्ञान समझो भाई टेंशन नॉट पी लो चाय एक और जॉइंट I'm so high हिप हॉप नाइट हिप हॉप डे हम जिए ये पूरा हक गंदी सोच चल बे हट स्केचिंग ब्रेकिंग राइटिंग एमसी ये सब कर सब जबरदस्त सब रहते मत ये कहता हूँ ओल्ड स्कूल न्यू स्कूल सब सुनूं फुल ऑफ फ्रीजेस सब करूँ रैप कैसे हाँ पावर मूव
My religion is rap, my religion is rap, R.A.P., R.A.P.
Doing my own thing, hardcore b-boy underground, and I don't sing.
My religion is rap, my religion is rap, R.A.P., R.A.P.
The four elements of hip-hop. My heart's pounding crazy when b-boys ride.
Hi, my name is Jaspal Singh, and in this short video I would like to present aspects of my new book, Transcultural Voices, Narrating Hip Hop Culture in Complex Delhi. Based on 8 months of linguistic ethnographic fieldwork, the book tells a story of hip-hop cultural production in Delhi. It provides a case study that advances our understanding of how voice and narrative, two concepts that have significant currency both in linguistics and in ethnography, can be employed as analytical vantage points to explore transcultural processes in complex global cultural formations like global hip-hop. The majority of materials that are used in this book were collected between early January and late September 2013 in Delhi, India. During the 8 months of ethnographic fieldwork, I interacted with research participants, mostly male breakers or b-boys in their late teens and early 20s. I conducted participant observation and recorded ethnographic interviews and informal interactions. But several other types of data were collected as well, such as recordings of public performances at jams, photographs, and audiovisual materials circulating online. I also participated in hip-hop cultural practices such as legal graffiti writing, emceeing, and producing beats. I attended events, socialized informally, and wrote extensive field notes. All these materials inform the story I tell in this book about a culture in the making. The narratives and the voices you will hear in this book do not exist in a cultural vacuum. The narrator's own voices are never fully their own, but as I argue with Bakhtin, they are always half someone else's. With the notion of transcultural voices, I aim to challenge beliefs that a speaker has fixed ideas in his head, having a voice, that can be transformed into messages, or that speakers have some sort of biological, psychological foundation that can be analyzed in linguistic terms. Instead, the book follows Bakhtinian epistemologies to understand a speaker's voice as an achievement of her narrative dialogues with other voices. Therefore, the unified speaker who utters in a synchronic, localized, and clearly delineable context vanishes as an object of analysis. Instead, I focus on how speakers orchestrate many voices in dialogic narratives to ultimately normalize their own voices. The transcultural voices you will hear in this book are thus infused with polyphonic orchestrations and indexical stylizations of the voices of other narrative figures or characters in a story. These figures speak from different historical space-times or chronotopes and from various local and global cultures, and they do the contextual work for narrators to depict themselves and their community in the normal complexity of Delhi at the beginning of the 21st century. I use the term transcultural voices as a heuristic to understand such processes of simultaneity, in-betweenness, and transformation in narrative normalizations of voice. The trans prefix gives me some queer wiggle room for making a range of subversive moves in my analysis and in my writing. This is so because transcultural voices engage rather than erase the complexities of languaging in globalization, even if they partially normalize complexity. On the pages of this book, I try to understand how hip-hop heads in Delhi construct such transcultural voices in narratives to normalize complexity and complexify normality. I also pay critical attention to the ways in which I, as the researcher, field worker, or analyst, complexify their, and indeed my, voices and narratives. The complex approach makes the book difficult to read because I'm not always able to give clear answers to what is going on exactly. Rather, my analytical focus is precisely on the tensions, the simultaneities that arise from the complex narrative normalizations of voice. My participants' normal voice often appeared when they told me stories or narratives, and especially in the final parts of narratives, when they resolved the tensions they created and put forward their own voices. Narratives have traditionally been understood as consisting of at least 2 or 3 parts, a beginning, a middle, and an end, as in Aristotle's classic definition, or an orientation complicating action and resolution, as in Labov and Waletsky's 1967 highly cited conceptualization. While I work with this structural approach to narrative, I understand narratives as social practice, following Anna Defina, for instance, or Alexandra Yerakopoulou. Storytelling plays an important role for all of us in maintaining interpersonal relationships, understanding and grappling with our pasts and futures, and making tacit knowledge explicit and experiential. In fact, I would even argue that storytelling, and research for that matter, is in itself a hip-hop practice. Telling one another stories about how hip-hop shaped one's life and will do so in the future is an essential ingredient of hip-hop conviviality. Stories position hip-hop heads and their hoods within a global topography and chronology of hip-hop. Such a perspective would allow us to understand that these stories are not only metapragmatic accounts about hip-hop, but are also themselves pragmatic hip-hop cultural practice. In other words, the stories are not just on hip-hop, they are hip-hop. To further complexify this point, I decided to include Chapter 7, which presents a multimodal analysis of interactive and competitive hip-hop dance, known as breaking, in which I argue that the b-boys dance narratives in the ciphers with their bodies. The young men and women who you will meet on the pages of this book normalize their voices in the narratives to present an authentic, historically situated, cosmopolitan, spiritual, and masculine hip-hop identity. As you will learn when reading this book, their normal-sounding voice is always constructed in opposition to an abnormal voice. The narrators draw on a range of linguistic, discursive, and embodied strategies to orchestrate these voices in their narratives. For example, they style shift prosodic voice qualities, such as intonation, to abnormalize the voice of the other, which in turn normalizes the voices of the self, as I show in Chapter 4. They also engage in translingual remixing to simultaneously challenge and reproduce dominant linguistic ideologies and associated identities, as I show in Chapter 5. And, as I show in Chapter 6, they synchronize historicities to construct foreseeable and coherent futures for themselves. And in Chapter 7, I show how they use their moving, standing, and dancing bodies as somatic voices in embodied narratives to construct b-boy masculinity. Finally, in Chapter 8, I show how one narrator develops methodologies for practicing, understanding, and overstanding hip-hop culture. These narratives provide important insights into how the emerging Delhi hip-hop scene grappled with what it meant to be involved with Indian hip-hop at that point in time. Ultimately, to arrive at a deeper understanding of hip-hop knowledge and hip-hop knowledge of self, or the fifth element, and to thereby position themselves as hip-hop heads, as practitioners who own hip-hop and look into a future with or without hip-hop. I hope that the narratives and the ways I present them can do something to contribute to our culture's own understanding of itself. Thank you very much.